It is the year 850 AD, and a young goat herder named Kaldi sits on a rocky hillside in the Ethiopian highlands, confused. His goats have been acting strange all afternoon, jumping, bleating, spinning in tight circles, refusing to settle down for the night. He watches them nibble the red cherries from a low, scrubby bush, and within minutes, the same feverish energy takes hold. Kaldi is tired, but curiosity pulls him forward. He picks a handful of the fruit, chews the sweet pulp, and feels a sudden sharp clarity wash over his mind. Does not know it yet, but he has just discovered the most powerful legal stimulant in human history. Today, that same berry is ground, brewed, and consumed by over 2 billion people every single day. It is the second most traded commodity on Earth after crude oil. It fuels the global economy, wakes up the modern world, and costs less than $1 a cup. But how did a wild jungleberry become the engine of industry, the spark of revolution, and the quiet companion of nearly every morning on the planet? The answer is stranger, darker, and more surprising than any story you have been told. To understand coffee, you have to go back long before Kaldi. Coffea arabica plant is native to the understory of the highland forests of Ethiopia and South Sudan. It evolved in deep shade, under a canopy of taller trees, in a narrow band of altitude and rainfall that exists almost nowhere else on Earth. The plant produces a small red fruit, the coffee cherry, and inside that fruit are 2 flat seeds, the beans. The secret is caffeine, a potent alkaloid that evolved as a natural pesticide. It paralyzes and kills insects that try to eat the leaves or fruit, while giving mammals a mild neurological jolt. Thousands of years, the plant thrived in obscurity. Local tribes chewed the raw cherries for energy during long hunts, or fermented the pulp into a weak wine. But no one thought to roast the seed. That discovery, when it came, would change everything. It is believed that sometime before the 10th century, the practice of roasting and brewing coffee beans emerged in the Sufi monasteries of Yemen, just across the Red Sea from Ethiopia. The Sufis, who performed long night prayers and meditations, needed something to keep them awake and focused. Boiling the roasted ground beans in water produced a dark, bitter drink that sharpened the mind and suppressed sleep. They called it kahwa, an Arabic word that originally meant that which prevents sleep. For the Sufis, coffee was not a luxury. It was a spiritual tool, a way to stay connected to God through the long, dark hours of the night. The drink spread through the monasteries of the Arabian Peninsula, and within 100 years it had become a fixture of daily life in the great port cities of the Red Sea. By the mid-15th century, coffee had reached Mecca, Medina, and Cairo, moved through the Islamic world with astonishing speed. The reason was not just the taste. It was the social space it created. Coffee houses began to appear in every major city, known as kahvehane in Persia and kahvehan in Ottoman Turkish. These were not quiet cafes. They were loud, crowded, argumentative rooms where men gathered to talk politics, tell stories, play chess, and discuss religion. The drink itself seemed to encourage debate. It sharpened the tongue as much as the mind, and that made the authorities nervous. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, Beg, declared coffee haram, forbidden by Islamic law. I argued that it was an intoxicant, that it led to immoral behavior, and that the coffee houses were dens of sedition. He ordered all coffee houses closed and the beans burned in the streets. But the ban did not last. The Sultan in Cairo, a coffee drinker himself, overruled the governor and reinstated the drink. The incident was the first of many attempts to suppress coffee. And every single one would fail. Because once people taste a drug that makes them feel more awake, more focused and more alive, no decree can take it away. By the 16th century, coffee had become a strategic commodity. The port of Mocha was the only legal source of exported coffee in the world. The beans were jealously guarded. Every shipment was inspected. No fertile seeds were allowed to leave the port. All beans were boiled or roasted to prevent germination. The Yemeni merchants held a total monopoly on the world's coffee supply, and they grew rich beyond imagination. The monopoly lasted for nearly 100 years. European traders, who had discovered coffee in the markets of Constantinople, were desperate to break it. They wanted the plant itself, not just the roasted beans. But every attempt to smuggle a live coffee plant out of Yemen failed. The seeds would not survive the journey, or they were confiscated at the docks. Then, in 1616, a Dutch merchant named Peter van den Broek managed to steal a single coffee plant from Mocha. They brought it to Amsterdam, where it was planted in the botanical gardens. That one plant was the ancestor of nearly every coffee tree in the Western Hemisphere today. From it, the Dutch cultivated seedlings and shipped them to their colonies in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and Java in modern Indonesia. The Java coffee industry exploded. By the early 1700s, the Dutch were supplying Europe with coffee grown not in Yemen, but in their own tropical colonies. Their monopoly was broken, and the price of coffee began to fall. But the story was far from over. In 1714, the mayor of Amsterdam sent a single coffee seedling to King Louis XIV of France as a diplomatic gift. The plant was kept in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, under glass. It became a botanical celebrity. A young French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu, stationed in Martinique, was obsessed with the idea of bringing coffee to the Caribbean. He begged for a cutting from the royal plant. The court refused. So one night, he stole it. Gabriel de Clieu smuggled the stolen cutting across the Atlantic on a ship called the Dromadaire. The journey was brutal. The ship was plagued by storms, then by a calm that left it drifting for weeks. Fresh water ran low. De Clieu shared his own ration with the precious plant, keeping it alive in a glass box on the deck. Pirate attack nearly ended everything. And then, to make matters worse, a jealous passenger tried to sabotage the plant by tearing off a branch. De Clieu caught him and had him locked in the hold. After nearly 3 months at sea, the cutting arrived in Martinique, wilted but alive. It was planted in the volcanic soil of the island, and it thrived. That single cutting, the entire coffee industry of the Caribbean, Central America, and South America was born. Every coffee plant in Brazil, Colombia, and Costa Rica, billions of trees, traces its lineage back to that one stolen seedling in 1723. The explosion of coffee in the Americas was not gentle. It was built on the backs of enslaved Africans. The European powers, France, Spain, Portugal, Britain, all realized that coffee grew exceptionally well in the tropical highlands of the New World. But the labor required to plant, tend, harvest, and process the beans was immense. Coffee is a finicky crop. It takes 3 to 4 years for a tree to bear fruit. The cherries do not ripen all at once, so a single tree must be picked multiple times over the harvest season. It is painstaking, back-breaking work. Not the colonial powers had no intention of paying for it. So they turned to the transatlantic slave trade. By the mid-18th century, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, had become the world's largest coffee producer. It was also one of the most brutal slave colonies in history. Enslaved workers were forced to work from before dawn until after dark, carrying heavy baskets of cherries up and down steep mountain slopes. Net mortality rate was staggering. The French planters worked their slaves to death and simply replaced them with new shipments from Africa. Coffee that fueled the salons of Paris, the coffee that Voltaire drank while writing his philosophical treatises, the coffee that funded the French Enlightenment. It was all soaked in blood. That truth is not a metaphor. It is a fact. The brutality of the coffee plantations in Saint-Domingue did not go unanswered. In 1791, the enslaved population of the colony rose up in what became the Haitian Revolution. It was the only successful slave revolt in history that led to the founding of a new nation, and coffee was at the center of it. The revolutionaries, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, understood that coffee was the colony's economic lifeline. They burned plantations, destroyed coffee fields, and targeted the infrastructure of the export trade. Within a decade, the world's largest coffee producer had collapsed. The price of coffee in Europe soared, and the power vacuum was quickly filled by a new player, Brazil. Brazil had been growing coffee since the early 18th century, but it was a minor producer. The collapse of Saint-Domingue changed everything. Brazilian planters saw an opportunity and seized it with ruthless efficiency. They cleared vast stretches of the Atlantic forest, burned the land, and planted coffee on an industrial scale. The labor force was again enslaved. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888. By the mid-19th century, Brazil was producing more than half of the world's coffee. The country's economy became completely dependent on the bean. Coffee barons grew richer than kings. They built railroads, founded banks, and controlled the government. The phrase coffee with milk, café com leite, became a political term describing the alliance between the coffee-rich state of São Paulo and the dairy-producing state of Minas Gerais, which together dominated Brazilian politics for decades. But the boom came with a cost. The monoculture of coffee stripped the soil of nutrients. When a coffee frontier was exhausted, the planters simply moved further inland, burning more forest. The environmental destruction was catastrophic, and the human cost was even worse. The enslaved workers who built Brazil's coffee empire endured conditions that were, by many accounts, even more brutal than those in the Caribbean. They were worked in chains, housed in filthy barracks, and subjected to routine whippings. The coffee that sweetened the mornings of Europe and America was harvested by hands that had no freedom, no pay, and no hope. That is not ancient history. Vast enslaved workers in Brazil were not freed until 1888, well within the lifetime of some people alive today. The 19th century saw coffee transform from a colonial luxury into a global necessity. The Industrial Revolution created a new class of factory workers who needed something to keep them alert through long, monotonous shifts. Coffee was the perfect solution. It was cheap, easy to prepare, and delivered a reliable jolt of energy. Factory owners began providing free coffee to their workers, not out of generosity, but because it increased productivity. The drink that had once been the preserve of Ottoman intellectuals and European aristocrats was now the fuel of the working class. At the same time, a technological revolution was brewing in the kitchen. In 1865, the first commercial coffee roaster was patented in the United States. Before this, coffee was typically bought green and roasted at home in a frying pan, an inconsistent and smoky process. A commercial roaster produced a uniform, dark roast that tasted the same every time. Then came the vacuum-sealed can, invented in 1900, which kept roasted coffee fresh for months. And in 1908, a German housewife named Melita Bentz grew tired of the gritty sludge at the bottom of her cup. She took a sheet of blotting paper from her son's school notebook, punched holes in the bottom of a brass pot, and placed the paper inside. She had just invented the paper coffee filter. Her company, Melita, still exists today. These innovations did more than improve taste. They made coffee a mass-market commodity. In the United States, coffee consumption exploded. By the 1920s, Americans were drinking more coffee per capita than any other nation on earth. It was the drink of the jazz age, of the all-night diner, of the road trip and the office break room. Coffee had become woven into the fabric of daily life. But the global supply chain that delivered those beans to every corner of the world was fragile, volatile, and often violent. The 20th century brought coffee into the age of geopolitics. The price of the bean was no longer set by merchants in a single port. It was now shaped by wars, coups, and trade agreements that spanned the globe. During World War II, coffee became a strategic resource. Not the US. Military shipped millions of pounds of instant coffee to soldiers on the front lines. It was light, easy to prepare, and provided a quick stimulant in the chaos of battle. Instant coffee had been invented in 1901 by a Japanese chemist named Satoru Kato, but it was the war that made it a household name. After the war, the American soldiers came home with a taste for instant coffee, and companies like Nescafé and Folgers built empires on that craving. But the real power struggle over coffee was happening far from the American kitchen. In the decades after World War II, the United States became deeply involved in the politics of coffee-producing nations. The Cold War made every unstable country a potential battleground. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup in Guatemala, overthrowing the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz. One of the reasons, by technology. Arbenz had proposed land reforms that threatened the holdings of the United Fruit Company, which was also the largest coffee producer in the country. The coup installed a military dictatorship that lasted for decades and plunged Guatemala into a brutal civil war that killed over 200,000 people. Coffee was at the heart of it. The same pattern repeated across Latin America. Colombia, the National Federation of Coffee Growers, backed by the US government, used coffee revenues to fund anti-communist militias. In Brazil, the military dictatorship that took power in 1964 was supported by coffee oligarchs who feared leftist land reforms. In Vietnam, the French had introduced coffee during the colonial era, but it was the post-war period that turned the country into a coffee powerhouse. The Vietnamese government encouraged mass production of Robusta beans, a hardier, more bitter variety. Today, Vietnam is the second largest coffee producer in the world, and much of that coffee is grown on land that was defoliated with Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. The global coffee trade had become a web of exploitation, environmental destruction, and political manipulation. The bean that woke up the world was also keeping it in chains. Then, in the late 20th century, something unexpected happened. Coffee became cool. Decades, coffee had been a utilitarian drink, a bitter brown liquid consumed quickly in the morning, or from a styrofoam cup in a fluorescent-lit office. It was functional, not fashionable. But a revolution was brewing in Seattle. In 1971, 3 friends opened a small store in Pike Place Market, selling whole bean coffee from a roaster in the back. They named it after the first mate in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, Starbucks. For the first 10 years, Starbucks only sold beans and brewing equipment. They did not sell brewed coffee. The idea was that people would take the beans home and brew their own. It did not catch on. Then Howard Schultz joined the company. I had traveled to Italy and been mesmerized by the espresso bars of Milan, the hiss of the steam, the rich crema, the sense of community. Not convinced the founders to let him open a cafe that served drinks. The first Starbucks cafe opened in 1984. Within a decade, the company had exploded. By 2000, there were over 30,500 Starbucks locations worldwide. The specialty coffee industry was born, and with it came a new vocabulary: latte, cappuccino, macchiato, americano. Coffee was no longer just a commodity. It was an experience. The rise of specialty coffee had a profound effect on the entire supply chain. Consumers began to care about where their beans came from. Terms like single origin, fair trade, and shade-grown entered the mainstream. For the first time in centuries, there was pressure on the industry to treat farmers fairly and to protect the environment. But the reality is complicated. The vast majority of coffee is still grown by smallholder farmers who live below the poverty line. The price of coffee on the global commodity market has been volatile and often cruelly low. A farmer in Ethiopia might earn pennies for the beans that end up in a 5 latte in New York. The gap between the producer and the consumer is as wide as it has ever been. And there is another shadow looming over the industry: climate change. The Coffea arabica plant is exquisitely sensitive to temperature and rainfall. It grows best in a narrow band of altitude between 1,000 and 2,000 meters. As global temperatures rise, that band is shrinking. By 2050, scientists estimate that as much as 50 of the land currently used for coffee cultivation could become unsuitable. Wild Arabica, the genetic reservoir that gives our coffee its diversity and resilience, is already endangered. The very plant that Kaldi's goats discovered it on that Ethiopian hillside 1,000 years ago is now fighting for its survival. The story of coffee is the story of the modern world. It began as a wild berry in a forgotten Ethiopian forest, chewed by a curious goat herder on a quiet afternoon. It became a sacred tool for Sufi mystics, a forbidden drink in the mosques of Mecca, and a strategic monopoly guarded by the merchants of Yemen. It was smuggled across oceans by a French naval officer, with nothing but ambition and a stolen cutting. It was grown by enslaved hands in the Caribbean and by indentured laborers in the Brazilian jungle. It fueled the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the Cold War. It built empires and destroyed forests. It created fortunes and destroyed lives. And today, it sits in your kitchen, in a bag on your counter, or in a cup on your desk, as ordinary as tap water. Think about that for a second. The journey from that hillside in Ethiopia to your morning cup is a journey of over 1,000 years, across every continent on Earth, through every major economic and political upheaval in human history. The fact that you can buy a pound of it for $10 is not a sign of simplicity. It is a miracle of logistics, a monument to human ingenuity, and a reminder of human cruelty. Every sip contains a story. Question is whether you choose to taste it. The global coffee industry is now worth over $200 billion annually. But of that, less than 10 stays in the producing countries. The vast majority is captured by roasters, distributors, and retailers in the wealthy nations of the North. The farmers who pick the cherries by hand, who climb the steep slopes under the tropical sun, who sort the beans one by one, they often live on less than 2 a day. The system is not broken. It was designed this way. It was designed to extract value from the global South and deliver it to the global North. And it has been doing so for 500 years. But there is also hope. The specialty coffee movement has created a direct link between the farmer and the consumer. Fair trade certification, while imperfect, has raised wages for millions of farmers. Shade-grown coffee protects biodiversity and provides habitat for migratory birds. New varieties of Arabica are being developed that can tolerate higher temperatures and resist disease. The coffee plant itself, which has survived drought, pests, and colonial exploitation for centuries, is not giving up easily. Neither are the people who grow it. In Ethiopia, the birthplace of coffee, the government has trademarked the names of the country's coffee regions, Sidamo, Yirgacheffe, Harar, to ensure that the value stays with the farmers. Not on Colombia. Cooperatives are using blockchain technology to trace every bean from the tree to the cup, guaranteeing that the farmer receives a fair price. In Vietnam, smallholder farmers are experimenting with intercropping, planting fruit trees and shade trees alongside their coffee to create a more resilient ecosystem. The story of coffee is not over. It is entering a new chapter. And this time, the people who grow it are starting to write their own lines. So the next time you pour yourself a cup, pause for a moment. Look at the dark liquid. Smell the aroma. Out the heat of the sun on a mountain slope in Guatemala, the humidity of a rainforest in Sumatra, the call to prayer echoing over a mosque in Yemen. Think about the hands that picked the cherries, the ships that carried the beans, the machines that roasted them, the barista who steamed the milk, not by technology. And think about the fact that you are participating in a that is older than every empire that has ever risen and fallen. Coffee has outlasted them all, will probably outlast us. If this story has acknowledged you, if it made you look at your morning cup a little differently, then hit that subscribe button. We cover a story like this every week. The hidden history of the ordinary things that shape your world. and leave a comment. Which part of this story surprised you the most? Was it the goat herder, the stolen cutting, the roll of coffee in the Haitian Revolution, or the fact that climate change is threatening your morning coffee right now? I read every comment, and I want to know what stuck with you, not technology. Because the more we understand the stories behind the things we consume, the more we understand ourselves. And that is a kind of clarity no cup of coffee can give you. Thank you for listening. This has been Forgotten Flavors. And as always, stay curious.